I'm Drew James, and welcome to the Canada, Spokane, and Pacific Railroad. The CS&P is an HO scale freelance bridge line that connects Calgary, Alberta with Spokane, Washington, and is jointly owned by the Canadian Pacific and the Burlington Northern, and is set in 1981. In 2015, my wife and I bought a new house that had a large unfinished basement, and almost immediately, even before we closed on the house, my friend Dave Martini and I started to design a layout for the space that was geared towards operations. And what we ended up with is a 1,500 square foot layout with a 225 foot mainline run. There are 5 modeled towns on the layout, 1 large yard, over 20 industries, and a staging yard that represents both ends of the railroad. A typical operating session will last around 2.5 to 3 hours and will include 14 to 18 crew members, and we'll run around 20 trains under CTC control, and we'll move upwards of 225 cars over the course of the session.
The railroad consists of a single track main line running from Spokane to Calgary. It starts and ends in staging. There's a 12-track double-ended staging yard that represents both ends of the railroad. It dives beneath the center peninsula of the layout. Almost all the trains that operate begin and end in staging. The run through, the double-ended nature of the staging yard allows me for continuous running for open houses. It also allows for a quick restaging between operating sessions. Each track in staging is powered on individually from the fascia, and then there's a corresponding light bulb that goes on so operators can see when their train is powered. Additionally, there's a clipboard provided that tells what train and what engine is on every track so operators can easily find their train and know which track to arrive in at the end of their run. After departing staging, the main line runs along the Colville River and up into the town of Kettle Falls, Washington. Kettle Falls is one of the 2 major towns on the railroad, and it has a half a dozen major industries. Kettle Falls is actually large enough that it rates a dedicated crew during an op session to switch out the pulp and paper mill, the cold storage facility, and several other industries. Kettle Falls has an industrial switching area. The major industry in that area is the Pacific Coast Pulp and Paper Mill. It also has a Washington milling facility, as well as several other smaller industries. This area, Kettle Falls, will switch out 20 to 25 cars during a typical operating session. Heading north out of Kettle Falls, the next town you'll arrive at is Northport, Washington. Northport is a small town located on the Columbia River with only a couple of industries and a team track, but it still rates daily service on a local turn from the Nelson Yard. At Northport, one of the things you can see is the fast clock. We run a 5-to-1 fast clock during operating sessions, and there are fast clocks located at every town, either on the wall or on the fascia. Shortly after departing Northport, heading north, trains will come to CP 442. CP 442 is important because it is the border between the United States and Canada. Shortly after entering the United States, we come to CN Junction and the crossing of the Columbia River on the main line. The Canadian National Railway has trackage rights from the junction here all the way over to Castlegar and chooses to run 1 train in each direction during a typical operating session. I consider this area to be the signature scene on the layout, and is a good place to talk a little bit about backdrops and scenery. First, the backdrop. The backdrop was provided by Lark Products, Bill Brown's company, and Bill took pictures that my wife and I had taken in the Pacific Northwest and turned them into backdrops, which we then installed. And then we built the scenery to match up with the backdrop, the river, the corresponding cliffs. The bridge itself was scratch built by John Roche, by a friend of mine. The foliage, the trees, most of the trees are scratch built on the layout. There's about 1,500 trees. Some of them are super trees. There is a mixture of static grass and ground foam to create the rest of the scenery. After crossing the river, continuing northbound, you enter the town of Boundary. Boundary's primary railroad activity is the BC power plant located there, which receives coal every day. After a long run from Boundary, the next town on the layout is a very busy town of Castlegar. Castlegar has several industries, including the large sawmill, which requires servicing every day. It is an area where there are typically several meets of mainline trains, and the Canadian National and the CS&P interchange in Castlegar. There's a small two-track stub-ended yard for that purpose. Canadian National breaks off and runs to the west out of Castlegar. All locomotives on the CS&P are sound equipped. The largest town on the railroad is the town of Nelson, British Columbia. It is where the CS&P's primary yard is located. The yard in Nelson has the capacity for about 80 cars, but you'll typically find 30 to 40 cars in the yard at any given time. It's a 7-track yard, 7 stub-ended track with 2 arrival and departure tracks as well. The yard is worked by 1 or 2 switch engines and a crew of 2 during an operating session. Many trains either originate or have blocks of cars to be set out or picked up in the Nelson yard area. Located in Nelson is the engine service facility. Yard operators will, in addition to switching cars, will hostle engines onto and off of trains that arrive and depart. The locomotive power on the railroad is about 50% provided by the Burlington Northern and 50% provided by the Canadian Pacific. It consists primarily of first and second generation diesels. Also located in Nelson is the Nelson Passenger Station. This is the largest passenger station on the railroad. The structure itself was scratch built by one of our division members, Len Amrine, based on the prototype that is in Nelson. Passenger service is important to me. One of my inspirations for modeling this part of the country when I model is that I had the good fortune of riding the Canadian across Canada several times in the early 1980s. So I knew that I wanted to model passenger service. So even though in 1981 Amtrak and Via Rail had come about, I decided that on this railroad, passenger service would continue as a gesture of goodwill to the communities and to advertise their freight service. Nelson has a number of industries that need to be serviced on a daily basis, including the Canadian Grain Company, Martini Manufacturing, and several other industries. A dedicated switch crew runs from the yard every day over into this industrial area to switch out these industries. This is one of the more challenging switching areas on the layout. The railroad is controlled by the dispatcher here in the dispatcher's office using a CTC system implemented in JMRI. There is a 14-node LCC, a new NMRA standard, located underneath the layout. Into that network, all of the turnouts, the signals, and detectability of all the trains is fed into that network, which then can be displayed here on the control panel in the dispatcher's office. We are in the process of replacing the virtual CTC panel with actually a replica of a US&S panel, which is currently under construction and hopefully will be done by the end of the year. Ken Cameron has been instrumental in this activity of implementing the JMRI part of the system. Besides the sound on the locomotives, there are several ambient sounds on the layout, implemented primarily through sound modules, many of which are integrated into the LCC system. So for example, you can hear the hobo singing. You can hear the sawmill sign. You can hear running water down the rivers and waterfalls. And you know the workers are hard at work in the pulp and paper mill. Let's track train number 2, the northbound International Limited, as it departs Spokane staging on its northbound run towards Kettle Falls. Train number 2 has departed Northport, Washington, and is now approaching the boundary between the United States and Canada. Canadian customs officials will board the train in the town of Boundary, just north of the border. The Northwest Limited crosses the bridge over the Nelson Yard throat before it rounds the bend into the town of Castlegar. The dispatcher has put train SC32, a manifest freight, onto the siding to allow train number 2 to pass. Train number 2 has boarded its passengers at Castlegar and departs heading northbound around the large horseshoe curve in front of the Crestwood sawmill. It's heading on to its last leg of the journey before it arrives in Nelson. The Northwest Limited arrives at the station in Nelson, British Columbia. After a short station stop here, the train will continue on northbound, past the Nelson Yard, and on to its final destination in Calgary, represented by staging.